Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor, Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. We got a fascinating episode lined up for you today. My guest is Dr. Tamar Mitz. She is an assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, and Dr. Mitz has worked extensively looking at terrorist radicalization online, and in particular focusing on ISIS, but now shifting more towards the Taliban. And so in this episode, we are going to look at 3 of Dr. Mitz's studies. And each of them is really interesting, not just from a content perspective, but also how Dr. Mitz uses social media data in a way that really showcases what we can answer with this type of data, really going beyond, a classic analysis of tweets, but really building an interesting data set that we'll talk about at the beginning of the episode, and some really interesting variables that are built to test what explains pro-ISIS sentiment by looking at various things like far-right vote share in European countries and counter-extremism efforts on the ground in the United States. So we'll dive into that. I'm just going to read the titles of each of the studies, and you'll find links to them in the episode description if you want to dig further in depth. And these are really dense studies. So I think Dr. Mitz does an excellent job putting them into a kind of, common language, but I definitely recommend digging into the studies to see how sophisticated they are. The first one that we will discuss is called From Isolation to Radicalization, Anti-Muslim Hostility and Support for ISIS in the West. That is published in the American Political Science Review. The second study we'll break down is called Countering Violent Extremism and Radical Rhetoric. That's published in International Organization. And the third study is called Studying the Impact of ISIS Propaganda Campaigns, and that is forthcoming in the Journal of Politics. So all very nice journals and all very nice studies, and I'm looking forward to dive into them. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Tamar Mitz, Assistant Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Dr. Mitz, thanks for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we dive into the individual research projects we'll cover throughout the episode, all of them are one way or another connected to Twitter. So why is Twitter a good platform to study radicalization and counter-radicalization strategies?
That's a great question. And in fact, the answer to this question would vary over time. So Twitter used to be a good platform to study these questions because about 5-6 years ago, there has been much less moderation of extremist content on the platform, which allowed academic researchers like myself to access this information and study it systematically. And I will talk more about it after. But these days, actually, Twitter and other large platforms are actually taking down a lot of that content. And as a result, a lot of researchers like myself, we look for these kind of data elsewhere. So there's many more platforms today that are not Twitter, but look like Twitter, where these groups are active on. So the answer to this question is that it used to be very easy to get data on this kind of activity, but not so much anymore.
Right. And I think what's cool about your research is that you've built a really impressive data set of ISIS sympathizers on Twitter and their followers. And it's not just, pulling tweets and analyzing them, but you've done a couple manipulations to the data. So could you outline for us how you built that data set, and in particular, how you were able to classify pro-ISIS accounts and estimate their geographic location?
Yeah, so one of the nice things, I think, if someone is interested in social media and politics more generally, is to think about these kinds of data from multiple angles, from multiple dimensions. And what I was able to do with the ISIS Twitter data set was to begin thinking, okay, how do groups like the Islamic State, for example, recruit supporters? Well, often they have their own handles on these platforms, let's say Twitter in this case, around which they try to attract supporters and followers that essentially create networks around them. So what I did was to start with those what I call core accounts, those accounts that were most likely to be affiliated with the group, and then access through these accounts the networks, the users that followed them. That ended up being the basis of a data set that I looked to analyze from different dimensions. So I looked at the content that they posted over time and classified it to different categories. I looked at how the nature of the network connections between users can tell us something about where users are physically located around the world. And by doing these different triangulations, I was able to get a lot more out of the data than if you just, looked at it in a more shallow way.
Definitely. And I think, for the researchers out there listening will know that very few tweets are actually geolocated. But you use some type of spatial algorithm to connect users to their location.
Yeah, so that was a really cool tool that I discovered when I was still in grad school. It's actually developed in the computer science part of the academy. And the idea there was that even though many users do not disclose their location, especially not their tweet level location, many will still report some sort of location in their user level information. And that information could be exploited to understand where users who are not reporting location are likely located. And the way this algorithm works is that it looks at the networks of each user. Let's say me and you, we all have the people that we follow that follow us and with whom we tend to interact. And research in this area has found that more often than not, people who are more physically proximate to each other tend to interact more with each other. This data point also changes over time as we become more connected and move, but on average, this is a finding that has been found in multiple platforms. So what the algorithm does is tries to infer along multiple levels of the network where somebody is located based on where their network is located. And this is essentially what I applied for this data set. And it was a really good application because I had so much information on who followed whom over time. So yeah, that's how I did that one.
Right. I think it's a really cool innovation, and it becomes important later when you try to match these up with different type of local level variables, which I think are super interesting. But the first study I'd like to cover is one where you sought to understand some of the mechanisms that might contribute to pro-ISIS radicalization. And in that study, you focus particularly on radicalization in 4 European countries: France, Germany, Belgium, and the UK. So could you broadly describe the motivations for conducting that study and why you focused on European cases specifically?
Great question. So the time that I started working on this was when I was doing everything I just described in terms of getting the data and geolocating it. And that was around 2015 and 2016, a time around which there was a lot in the news about foreign fighters traveling to fight with the Islamic State in Syria, the Syrian civil war. And I looked at my data and I found that there was a lot of accounts in Europe. And that really drew my interest because it was not an obvious thing to me at the time, at least, that people who might be second, even third generation immigrants, many of them in the data set at least, would be even interested in traveling to a foreign country to risk their lives. And that was something that really drew my interest. And I was wondering whether I could understand, at least from this online perspective. All I had was the Twitter activity. But still with that, understand why they would do it. Why would they go so far away? So the reason was really this. I think I was in many ways driven by the news coverage on foreign fighters, as well as what I had available to me in the data. These 4 European countries in particular had a lot of available administrative data that I could use to match the Twitter data with. And that was really the key to the study that allowed me to make these inferences between what is happening in the physical area of where somebody is likely to be located and what is happening in their online world at the same time. And that was this kind of really interesting match that I was able to do.
Yeah, it's hard to think about now because everything's been dominated by COVID. But back in 2015, it was very much about ISIS and also the kind of rise of the far right parties in Europe. So you sought to examine whether data at the local level in these 4 countries would correlate with various pro-ISIS narratives on Twitter. Could you walk us through some of the key local level variables you sought to test and what types of narratives you used to classify pro-ISIS sentiment?
Yes, absolutely. So at the local level, I was looking to study and examine how much we find evidence in the data for different stories we hear about in the news. So at the time that the Islamic State was in the news more than COVID, of course, there were a lot of stories about no-go zones. There were stories about unemployment. And one story I was really curious to study in particular is the role of hate, experiencing hate and isolation from the local community. And the way I was approaching this was to say, okay, so can we find data points that would proxy these variables? So what I did was to look for data on unemployment, data on the share of migrants at the local level. In some countries, I even had information on areas where they're more likely to be people who are refugees. And I came to this very naively. I was interested in studying in which areas do we see more support for ISIS. And how did I measure that? I looked at the particular content that people post about. Now it's very common in many social media studies to do that. So today we could either train models or run different classifiers to identify particular types of sentiments and narratives. And what I did was to run several machine learning classifiers that learned to identify posts that endorse the Islamic State, for example, or posts that talk about what is happening in the territories of the caliphate or how to become a foreign fighter. And I used those metrics to identify in which physical locations do we see more of that kind of content.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I want to ask you about the machine learning component before we get to the findings too, because I think you got pretty good accuracy on these narratives. And this was, back in 2015-ish when the models weren't as sophisticated as they are now. So was there something in the data that was particularly conducive to machine learning, or how were you able to get such good accuracy?
Yeah, so to me at the time, I didn't think about it in that way. I just worked with what the models were reporting back. But now that I think about it, and I got this question often, I think what was driving the accuracy of the models was that the pro-ISIS content was kind of unique in the kind of words that were being used, especially as you think of more generic topics that people talk about on social media. And even among all of the accounts that I collected data for, pro-ISIS content was not that common. It was, a cluster. It was part of the topics that they talked about, but there was many more other topics and discourse that was present. So I think what happened technically is that the models were just really good at identifying words that predicted pro-ISIS rhetoric. And when I was trying to replicate that with a similar data set on hate groups in the United States, it was much, much harder. And this is when I thought about it. Okay, maybe it was just a case well suited for classification. There was more clear barriers between pro-ISIS rhetoric and the rest, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Little side tangent there, but what were the key findings coming out of that analysis? What types of political or demographic data seemed to contribute to pro-ISIS radicalization?
So based on these 4 countries and the accounts that I analyzed, the variable that had the strongest correlation with support for ISIS on Twitter was areas where far-right parties in Europe have been popular. And initially, this link is not necessarily obvious because, these two things almost look like two different types of radicalization. But when I dig deeper, I also noticed that this tended to happen in areas where there were higher number of hate crimes against non-native European and especially migrant populations. And the way I interpreted that finding was essentially this story about isolation. So areas where individuals who are not native to Europe are not very welcome. They experience hate, they experience discrimination. Maybe in these areas, you find more appeal to the narratives of the Islamic State. And this is what the data that I analyzed seems to suggest. In addition to experiencing isolation, I also analyzed other variables that, again, were very common in the narratives at the time. So I looked at high unemployment, to test essentially whether being unemployed is correlated with this kind of sentiment. And I did find some support for that. But when looking at the other explanations, like areas with high proportions of migrants or even areas with a high share of Muslims, this is data that I had in the UK, I actually found a negative relationship, meaning that in areas where you had more migrants, more people from Muslim population, you actually found less support for ISIS. And I think that also, to me, seems to suggest that the story here, if you think of online radicalization and how that might be shaped by offline context, even though I don't have perfect causal evidence, it seems to be that people who feel a more need for community online are those who might be more attracted by that kind of content, as opposed to the stories that at that time we heard in the media. There are many problems with these stories, and my data did not seem to support them either.
Yeah, I think particularly the last finding you mentioned is super interesting. The idea that the narrative was, if you have a high Muslim density in the population, like more Muslim enclaves would lead to more pro-ISIS sentiment. And you actually find the opposite of that.
Yeah, and I thought that was, it just complicates a very simple narrative that some have been advocating in the media. And I think those who are familiar with radicalization and, support for extremist movements know that it's often much more complex than the simple black and white stories we're trying to tell.
Absolutely. But I think the approach here is really interesting because these variables are relatively slow to change, meaning that it generally takes some time for far-right vote share or immigration patterns to drastically change. But using your data, you could also look at how external events, such as terrorist attacks or anti-Muslim marches, might affect pro-ISIS expressions on Twitter. So what type of high-density events did you examine, and what were the findings there?
Yeah, exactly. So, if you think about, you have a spatial connection between the online and offline world. Well, you also have over time connections. So you can analyze data in both dimensions. So what I did there was to look at several events. Some of them were violent events, like terrorist attacks that were perpetrated by the Islamic State around the same time, and also even one propaganda released by the group. But then I also looked at the other side, looking to see what happens when there is anti-Muslim marches in Europe. What happens then? And what I found was pretty much similar patterns. Essentially, as you might expect, events like terrorist attacks increased these users' support for ISIS on Twitter. But that increase has been strongest in the areas where you might expect more isolation, areas with high levels of far-right support. It's the same pattern also found around these marches. So even though these are slow-moving variables, we did find patterns in the time dimension that are still consistent with the same story.
Yeah, and for our European listeners, those anti-Muslim marches were generally around the Pegida protests.
Pegida, that's correct. Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting, this kind of mechanism between isolation and radicalization. But I think your findings here beg the question, well, how do we counter online radicalization? And in the second study I'd like to discuss, you looked at how on-the-ground counter-extremism efforts might affect the online activity of the pro-ISIS users in your dataset. So first, could you describe what type of counter-extremism events you examined and how you were able to pair those up with the pro-ISIS Twitter users in the dataset?
Yes. So this is such a great follow-up on the study because in response to what we have seen with the Islamic State around the same time, there was this proliferation of counter-extremism activities to combat that threat. And one of the most popular efforts that many governments adopted, both in Europe, in the United States, as well as in other countries, was what often is being called community engagement programs. So these are programs that aim to almost like put the burden on local communities, neighborhoods, families to identify, people in the community who might be radicalizing. It's not very clear how that might look like from the outside world, but the idea was, there are certain types of behavior that could be threatening. And if these behaviors are reported in time, maybe violent extremism and acts of violence could be prevented. So as a result, these programs essentially revolved around events that took essentially training events of sorts that trained local communities to identify signs of extremism. What I did in the second study was to look at a similar spatial linkage between online Twitter activity and offline events to counter extremism, this time in the United States, mainly because of data availability. And what I did there was to see what happens to those same ISIS supporters on Twitter when, essentially after, community engagement activity are happening in their proximity.
Yeah, I remember I did an internship for the State Department in the U.S. Embassy in Sweden, and we were working with those type of programs. It was things like training Muslim communities how to use computers, for example, but they'd have the State Department logo as a way to kind of build good feelings about the United States from these communities. But was that the type of events you were looking at, or was it more trained at like identifying when your son becomes radicalized?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So often these meetings were as part of other engagement community that had nothing to do with the Islamic State. But as the threat became more evident, more of the meetings centered around extremism. I should say that in the US, at least, that's a program I know better, the goal was not to target Muslim communities, at least officially, but practically they were the communities that saw the most targeting. And there was a lot of outcry about why are we being targeted with these programs where there's extremism elsewhere as well. But that's, I guess, a topic for a different conversation. But yes, often the trainings had other components, like different types of trainings, different types of activities. But many of them around the time of the study that I conducted were around extremism and essentially what is radicalization and how does one look like when they become more radical, things like that.
Gotcha. But before we get to the results, you posit early in the study that there are two potential mechanisms that these counter-extremism efforts might result in. The first is de-radicalization, and the second is strategic behavior. So could you describe these two potential scenarios?
Yes. So if you try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who supporting groups like ISIS at the time is, formally being defined as a terrorist group that should be banned, and there are consequences for supporting the group at that time in the US. You could be arrested, you could be put in jail. So from that perspective, I was thinking, okay, so if somebody knows that they might be monitored, or the knowledge of monitoring increases in certain points in time, what might they do? So on one hand, if you think of the counter-extremism community engagement programs, if they're effective, you might think that a direct consequence of that on the online world would be lower engagement with ISIS because, logically speaking, when somebody is de-radicalized, maybe they're less interested in engaging with the group online. So this is a more simple de-radicalization mechanism. But the strategic behavior one is to try to kind of think about it, more, more strategically. It's not the best word, but essentially, maybe people who are aware that these activities are happening, but still want to continue to engage with the group can take actions that will allow them to continue to engage with the group, but in a way that they will not be seen as publicly as on Twitter, because Twitter is a very public platform. So I had data actually in this study to evaluate these two mechanisms right next to each other.
Right. And you clearly find support, I think, for the strategic behavior hypothesis. So could you describe what types of strategic behavior you found that these counter-extremism efforts seem to drive?
Yes. So first, I found that support for ISIS significantly decreased in the areas where these engagement events happened, even up to a month after the events. This data point actually supports both hypotheses. If somebody is de-radicalizing, they might post less about ISIS, and the same thing if they're acting strategically. So what I try to do is look for more data points that could help me evaluate, okay, is this driven by the de-radicalization or strategic behavior? And what I did there was to look at metadata that we can get from Twitter today, which is the user level information. For example, what is the kind of profile picture that somebody uses, or how do they describe themselves? And in addition to that, I try to find evidence for whether they are interested in moving to another platform, a platform that might be more secure in the communication. And what I found was actually really supportive of that story, which individuals who were close to these community engagement events started changing the profile pictures after and started migrating to Telegram, I could not directly measure their migration, but I could measure their referencing to Telegram and advertising their accounts on Telegram right after. So combined with a decline in pro-ISIS tweeting, I thought that was pretty compelling evidence that there might be some strategic behavior going on here.
Definitely. I thought especially looking at changing profile pictures was really interesting. But what does this say about social media platforms' approaches to content takedowns? I mean, social media platforms were scrambling to block ISIS propaganda, but I think your study supports mounting evidence that this approach might have adverse backfire effects.
Yeah, and that's actually something I'm studying now in other contexts, not just ISIS. I think when we talk about taking down extremist content, there's a lot of things we need to think about, and one of the main ones is thinking about this from this entire internet ecosystem point of view. So if we take down accounts from, let's say, Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, often what we find is that groups are migrating elsewhere and they are still able to attract a significant amount of followers to the other platforms. So I think we haven't yet figured it out completely. How should we think about the threat of extremism and violence in a world where we have multiple online territories that groups can migrate from one to another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of like this, in a sense, it's almost maybe shifting accountability for Twitter to kick them off, but they're going to go somewhere else.
That's right. Yes.
So one thing I was curious about when reading your studies is this strategic behavior I once heard about where some pro-ISIS users would anticipate being blocked by Twitter. So they'd have a handle with a string of numbers, say, at jihadist101. And once they were blocked, they'd create a new handle and add +1 to the number. So Jihadist 102. And that way their followers could easily find and refollow the account. So I'm wondering if you saw any instances of that in your data, or how did you account for some users reestablishing accounts after being blocked?
Yeah. So I have seen that in my data for sure. It was hard often to track the exact user because even though the handle looked similar, often handles of different users looked similar. So in my particular data set, it was a bit harder to evaluate, but actually this is something that could be done more systematically. I haven't done at that level to this question, but others have. Those looking exactly at this question with a bit less data found a really interesting finding, which is when they were suspended and came back, they often tended to have significantly less followers afterwards. So even though they were able to come back and establish another online presence, extremist users who have been deplatformed and then replatformed became less relevant. So that actually, when we look at it from a within platform perspective, let's say Twitter, it seems to actually work in the sense that the audience is lower. I think what we don't know as well yet is what is happening elsewhere. And I think this is the frontier of where we should be looking at this time, looking at this cross-platform interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, one of the challenges there is that when these pro-ISIS sympathizers or whatever group, if they move from Twitter to, let's say, Telegram or WhatsApp, I mean, those platforms are encrypted. So it's really difficult to actually study them. So how are you thinking about that? Or what would you think about for how to get at these encrypted platforms? I know some journalists have tried to infiltrate the groups and collect the data that way, but do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think this is where we become much more limited. With my data collections thus far, I looked at public data that anyone with a sophisticated data collection process could get. And once we move to the encrypted world, it becomes significantly harder. And, there are also ethical questions surrounding it of how do you access it. And in the debates around deplatforming, a lot on the kind of more critical side of it would say that maybe it's good to get to, this is completely funny to say, but maybe we should let extremists be on the public platforms to some extent, because then at least they can be tracked as opposed to, places that are harder to access. This is not a debate. I have a clear idea yet myself what is better, but the fact that we have that problem is something that really, really interests me.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd like to kind of return to that a bit later on, but I want to touch briefly on a third study you conducted, which I think suggests that ISIS propaganda kind of has this interesting relationship where it might have adverse effects on some of its sympathizers, but really might harden its core base. So there you used computer vision to classify the content of ISIS propaganda and how it influenced expressions of support from pro-ISIS users who were exposed to that propaganda. So could you briefly describe what you found there regarding violent imagery in ISIS propaganda and how that might turn off some users but strategically appeal to ISIS's core audience?
Yeah, that was one of the cooler projects, I think, in terms of methodology. So when studying the other studies, I encountered a lot of propagation and dissemination of ISIS propaganda videos in the data set. And one thought was, okay, so could we study the effect of these videos? The trick there was to understand what was in these videos. And like you said, the violent imagery, which made the group actually really famous over time, all the brutalities that they used to document. So what we did in this project was to prevent our own trauma and our research assistants from watching this. We did not want to watch these videos. So what we did was to run them through computer vision models that can detect acts of violence. These models are being often used for, in different applications that aim to identify unsafe content. And through these models, we're able to identify pretty specific instances of violence as they were being captured by the models. For example, you can imagine different verbs that describe violent actions, as well as scenes in their aftermath. And what we did was to see how users who followed disseminators in the network reacted to these videos within 24 hours of their dissemination. Surprisingly, we found that most of the users decreased their support for the group in terms of their own posts and how much they talked about the group favorably after. And that was a bit counterintuitive, because so much of the discourse on the Islamic State and its followers on Twitter was centered around these brutalities. What we found was that even though the majority of the users who followed the Islamic State were not attracted or were not supportive, in their own words, of these videos, a significant portion of them did. And those were the users who have seen not only one, but who have been engaging positively not only with one, but with many of these kinds of videos, and also were more likely to, down the road, if you look at their outcomes 6 months later, were more likely to be deplatformed themselves for violating Twitter's terms of service. So I think there's a really interesting question about the strategy of disseminating violence online, is that most people really don't like to see it. It's not an appealing thing to watch. But for people who are core supporters or really deep in the weeds of these kinds of groups, this seems to be exciting for them. And it's a sad thing to say, but I think there is something in the radicalization process that somebody might go through that would allow them to accept and legitimize brutal acts of violence. And that's also concerning as well.
Right. And I think you write in the paper at some point that this violent imagery seems to have a negative effect for like the broad, ISIS sympathizers. But for this core group that is, truly radicalized, they are also the ones that are most likely to become foreign fighters. So maybe ISIS, I don't know how sophisticated their social media team is, but maybe they're seeing this, that it doesn't really get good favorability, but it does bring in more foreign fighters.
Yeah, and maybe it's a screening mechanism, right? So if you are treating your followers with a certain kinds of content, you can see who reacts, in what ways, and those who seem to be, more interested in it, there are other ways to follow up and then engage them more. And I think that this might be what was happening here as well.
And also, you've been focusing on the violent imagery, but I think other types of ISIS propaganda seem to work.
Yeah, actually, most of it. So first I would say, if you just look at the distribution of what was in ISIS videos, the majority of it was not violence. The majority of the content was other themes, other recruitment materials that attempted to attract supporters. And that really worked well for them, if you count endorsement of ISIS in the aftermath of these videos. So we found, for example, that content that is very critical about Western countries and highlights what Western countries are doing in the Middle East, especially from the violent side, are receiving a lot of support. Content that is talking about how great is the caliphate, the territories that the group was controlling at the time, received a lot of support. And I think that this also shows that when we talk about propaganda, or we talk about online strategies, I think it's really important to know that there are different kinds of messages and they work in different ways. And maybe also they are being exploited in different ways strategically. And I think this is another one of these frontiers about social media and the politics, especially the more violent side of politics, that we don't understand that well yet. And that study kind of shows some evidence in that direction.
Definitely. It's super interesting. And before we get to my last question, I have a question about the computer vision, because I know you use the recognition API, and
Yeah.
I have a little bit of experience with that as well. But you were looking at object detection, and I'm just curious about how well you thought it performed, because I've just played around with the object detection part, and it might classify a plane as a rocket or a spaceship or something.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about how what your experience was like working with that.
Yeah, so same in that way. So I think if you try to identify particular objects, that are very particular, these models are not that great yet, because like you said, objects that have similar outlines could be classified as the same thing. And that's a common problem with computer vision models. I think when you try to, however, look at more broader categories that you are okay with some noise around the boundaries, especially with a violent content, we found that this has been very consistent. And we did validate a small part of these videos, and especially those that had this kind of high proportion of objects that we classified ourselves as violent, then that worked. But in another example, if you want to identify human, it will likely identify human okay. But if you try to identify a particular person, or you kind of go with more in detail, I think that's where it starts to be not that great. So I think we still have a way to go with these models. But from a social science perspective, I think there's a lot of promise in using those kinds of models in applied research and try to understand the visual content of media, not just the textual content.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I saw how in the appendix you were reporting the objects by their confidence scores. I thought that was a cool way to be transparent about it. But lastly, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how generalizable the ISIS case is to online radicalization, because I'm just thinking, ISIS was this kind of an exception when it comes to terrorist groups, and that they were particularly brutal and actually proclaimed this territorial caliphate. So particularly as we head into a Taliban-governed Afghanistan, where many Taliban officials are still permitted to be active on social media, do you think similar radicalization dynamics might apply?
Yeah, so I think ISIS was unique in the way they engaged online and the sophistication that they used. I think they have inspired a lot of other groups. So if you look at other groups today, you will see more a similar kind of online behavior. But you are correct that most of these groups do not control territory in the offline world. And the Taliban is another one of these groups. And in fact, maybe it will surprise you or not, I am collecting data on the Taliban and have been doing that way before the US pullout in August. And I think that the Taliban is similar to ISIS in some ways, but it's different in others. And I think that part of the difference is the way the group is interacting with other actors globally, as opposed to for example, what ISIS was at the time that it controlled territory. And I think that aspect is definitely different. What I think is similar, and that's what I would plan to study myself, is really that propaganda side of it. What are the kind of messages that the Taliban is sending to its followers, and how those messages are being received? I think that this is one of those puzzles, that you have this group that is now controlling a country, in some ways similar to the way ISIS controlled the territory. But the mechanisms around the way they acquire the territories are different. And I think that might factor into the way they engage online and the kind of messages that they're disseminating online. But I think I would love to answer that question again after I had some chance to look at the data that we've collected over the past few months.
Absolutely. Well, it's super interesting from not just the content perspective, but I think also the methodologies that you're employing. So Dr. Mix, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Tamar Mitz, Assistant Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Be sure to check the episode description for links to the studies we discussed in the episode. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll soon be heading down to Berlin for a little research day and taking my recorder with me. So I look forward to broadcasting some research that's happening down in the German capital. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.